Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett, and today I'm going to read chapter 24 from the third leg of the journey that the seven sisters are going on. It's from the book Seven Sisters, The Trek. It was thrilling when the teamsters brought the Dixie train wagons up from the corrals and formed a line by the outfitting store where each wagon family would load their issued food. This consisted of flour, sugar, beans, rice, cornmeal, dried apples, bacon, ham, salt, baking powder, and sundries, such as soap, wheel grease, and even needles and thread. Each pioneer also received a woolen blanket to add to their other bedding. The wagons that had traveled out from St. George area were filled with 10,000 pounds of Utah cotton, which brought market price in Omaha. Other wagons brought sacks of flour to be deposited at 4 storage stations on their way to Florence. This flour would be picked up as needed on the way back to Utah to help feed the traveling immigrants. The flour was donated by Utah wards in return for tithing credits. On the way back to Utah, the wagons were loaded with merchandise not available in Utah, such as stoves and ovens for Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, telegraph wire to connect all the Mormon towns, and roofing for the Salt Lake Tabernacle, among other things. This merchandise covered the bottom of each wagon bed, and the rest of the room was taken up with the passengers' luggage, bedding, tents, cooking gear, and foodstuffs. No wonder the leaders encouraged them to walk alongside their wagons. There was hardly any room left for anyone to ride. "What are we taking to Utah in our wagon bed?" inquired Fanny as Hurricane helped them stack their supplies and luggage on top of 2 long rectangular wooden boxes that fit nicely into Lucy's wagon bed. "You will be carrying some of the most important cargo of any of the wagons." "Can you tell us?" begged Phoebe. "Guess." "Let's see," Fanny thought. "What could be so important? Rails for a railroad?" "No, they would be too heavy," said Hurricane. "How about furniture parts?" Susanna added. "Nope, they can make furniture in Utah." "Guns and ammunition?" Caroline ventured. "That's a pretty good guess, but no." "We give up. What is so important?" asked Phoebe. "Well, sisters, you are carrying some of the materials for the pipe organ that will go in the new tabernacle that is being built next to the temple." The twins smiled all over. "That is important cargo," said Fanny. "Yes, but there is something you need right now that is even more important than that. You need to go pick up your camp kettle. President Gates has purchased camp kettles, 6 and 10-quart pans, skillets, cups, plates, utensils, washpans, and chamber pots, which you will receive later this afternoon. And some of the sisters are given instruction relative to cookery over by the fire pits, starting in half an hour. I recommend all of you sisters learn how to cook over the campfire so that you can all take turns and it won't become a tedious task for just one person." The sisters agreed and soon found themselves in a group of about 30 women surrounding one of the fire pits in the cooking area of the camp. There were similar groups as far as the eye could see. The sisters watched with great intent. None of them had ever cooked outside before. If they had done any cooking at all, it was in pots over a kitchen fireplace or on the stove in the cooking galley on the Amazon. Of course, Caroline's parents had several cooks and servants who prepared sumptuous meals for her wealthy family. She had only been able to learn a few things in the cooking gallery on the Amazon. Now she was determined to learn how to cook and bake in these strange little camp pots that seemed to be the mainstay of pioneer cooking. "These 3-legged kettles can sit right down on a bed of coals," the teacher explained, as she threw a chunk of bacon into the demonstration kettle. She then adjusted the kettle squarely on the fire. Then biscuits, a loaf of bread, corn dodgers, or cake batter can be put inside. I'm going to demonstrate by stirring up some cornbread with some water, adding a little salt and sugar, and lastly, mixing in some baking powder. She dropped evenly spaced, heaping spoonfuls of batter into the now sizzling kettle. Next, put on the flat lid and put a shovelful of coals on top to help bake whatever is inside. You will need to watch it carefully because the food can burn very easily. We have a little booklet of recipes for each wagon. These have been tried and found to be successful by the sisters on previous wagon trains. You can also use your kettle to cook your ham or bacon or any wild game the hunters of your company present to you. You will occasionally find berry patches as you walk along the trail, and they can be used in making pies, cakes, or puddings. While the women of the companies were learning how to cook, the men were being trained to manage the cattle that were located in the corrals on the edge of the encampment. The Utah boys were the teachers and had to show the greenhorns how to get the animals yoked and hitched to the wagons. This was easier said than done because many of the cattle, which were newly purchased, had never had a yoke on them or pulled in tandem with another ox before. In addition to this, only a few of the immigrants had ever worked with oxen. They were mostly artisans in the old country, and if they couldn't find their kind of work in Utah, they would more than likely be forced to become farmers so they could provide food for their families. And for this reason, they needed to learn how to work with the animals. So this was all very new to them, and to add to all the confusion, some brethren couldn't speak English. And all the hollering and hallooing from the teamsters only caused more confusion in the corrals. It was like a brawl with all the unruly cattle balking against all the newcomers. Sir Evelyn was getting more and more frustrated with his ox. He finally swung his yoke out to the side and came back with full force, hitting the ox on the side of his head. The ox stumbled a little and bellowed loudly. "I'll teach you to mind me, you slow-witted dolt," he said, as he raised his yoke to strike again. Sir Evelyn, stop that," Curly said as he ran toward him. "You can't hit these oxen like that. What's the matter with you?" Sir Evelyn stopped in midair. "I was just teaching him a lesson in obedience. These oxen are to be treated with kindness, Sir Evelyn, or they won't perform their pulling duties. Then you will be at their mercy. They are crucial to your success in crossing the plains." "Well, I'm trying to yoke him, and the imprudent brute does nothing but run away from me." "Here, let me help you. I might just add that some men have been put out of wagon trains for beating animals. It's an unwritten law not to strike an animal, and we won't stand for it." Sir Evelyn was somewhat stunned at this reprimand. "I've always trained my horses with a spur and the whip. They need to be shown who is in charge." Curly was getting irritated. "Well, we've found most oxen respond better with kindness than with the spur and the whip. Oftentimes they are more intelligent than the man trying to yoke them." Sir Evelyn felt a flush of heat and irritation go through his body. He wanted to have the last word, but realized he needed to keep quiet and follow the rules of these Mormons if he was going to travel with them. He certainly didn't want to be put off the wagon train. George Careless was used to leading music, not yoking oxen. So when he tried to approach his ox with a yoke, the ox shook his head vigorously, and George scampered for the fence. "Brother Careless, you can't walk up to an ox straight on," said Hurricane, coming to his rescue. "You need to keep back and to the side of him as you approach." "I don't want to be derogatory," said George apologetically, "but it is my opinion this ox is not a Mormon and has nothing of the gathering spirit." Hurricane laughed involuntarily. "I've never quite heard it put that way before. I will have to agree with you. Even hitching well-broken cattle can be either a casual or hellish experience. There is an art and mystery to oxen, and experience has taught me that kindness to oxen availeth much. They come to know your voice, so you need to talk soothingly to them." "Do they like music?" questioned George. "I'm not sure. You can always try it. Maybe if I sing, they will get the idea." He started singing softly as he walked slowly up to the side of the oxen. "Israel, Israel, God is calling, calling thee from lands of woe. Babylon the great is falling, God shall all her towers o'erthrow." The ox seemed to be mesmerized by George's singing voice, and he swished his tail rhythmically. George was now close enough to slip the yoke over the ox's head. He kept singing, "Come to Zion, come to Zion. Please hold still, you big dumb ox. Come to Zion, come to Zion, and your ears I will not box." George successfully placed the yoke on the ox and fastened the bow underneath. "That was good," Hurricane laughed. "Now I'll hold the yoke while you bring another ox up to his side so we can yoke them together. Then you will have your team ready to hitch up to a prairie schooner." "Prairie schooner?" questioned George. "That's what we call a covered wagon," said Hurricane. "It looks somewhat like a schooner that sails across the prairie, doesn't it?" "I guess I can see that a little bit," said George, chuckling. "You Americans surely have some humorous idioms." Hurricane scratched his head. "Now it's my turn to ask you what you're talking about." Late in the afternoon, the leaders gave everyone an hour to themselves to rest or do whatever they wanted to do before they had to begin to prepare supper and get ready for their last prayer meeting in Florence. The children, led by the twins, used this time to gather away from the adults and play games. They weren't going to waste their time resting when they could be having fun playing with each other. Hurricane had showed them a game with a ball of twine and a good-sized stick that he kept behind his wagon seat. They chose up sides, set up 4 makeshift bases, and began to play a rousing game of rounders. Some adults continued working on their packing preparations, but some took the opportunity to rest in the shade and take a nap. The sisters, minus the twins, lay on their backs, heads together, and looked up through the trees at the clouds. They chatted, mused, and tried to let everything they had learned earlier that day sink into their heads. After a few minutes, someone walked into Caroline's peripheral vision. "Sister Cleverly?" came a voice. Caroline popped up, only to see Hurricane standing above her with his bullwhip in his hand. "Mr. Hurricane, you startled me," she said, a bit shaken. "I just wondered if you wanted to go over by the corrals and learn how to crack a whip. You indicated you wanted to learn how to do that." Caroline was delighted at this proposal. "I would love to, Mr. Hurricane," she said as she gathered up her skirt, jumped up, and followed him. "Caroline is going to learn how to crack a bullwhip?" Lavinia asked incredulously. "This should be interesting." As they walked along, Hurricane began his teaching. "First off, you have to realize while you're learning that you are going to whack yourself on your arms, legs, and the back of your head and neck." Then he paused and corrected himself. "Well, your skirt will probably keep the whip off your legs, I suppose. But for men in pants, we have to worry about our legs." He chuckled a bit uncomfortably. Caroline blushed as he continued. "Just remember, getting whacked goes with the territory until you learn how to control your whip." "What's that short, skinny leather strip at the end that is smaller in width than the rest of the whip?" "That is called a popper or cracker. That's what makes the cracking sound when you flip your wrist." "Are you sure I can do this?" "Sister Cleverly, I think you were born to do it." This caused Caroline to burst out laughing. "That's funny, Mr. Hurricane. I highly doubt if my parents would agree with you." When they got to the corrals, they walked a little bit past them to the clearing by the creek. Caroline was glad there wasn't anyone around to watch her make a fool of herself. Some safety advice before you start. Always look out for overhanging tree branches before you swing this thing, and don't aim it at people. "That's not hard to figure out," Caroline said with a grin. "Well, after you get hit once or twice, you'll realize how important it is to look around before you do any swinging." "I'll be very careful," she said apologetically. "Stand over there while I demonstrate," he said. Caroline obeyed as Hurricane unraveled the whip and let it stretch out behind him on the ground. "Hold your thumb on the top, pointing it straight down along the length of the whip. Proper whip technique doesn't require much muscle. It's timing. Swinging harder does create a bigger bang, but it also creates bigger welts, too." Caroline smiled to indicate she understood. Hurricane swung the handle of the whip forward, above his shoulder, pushed the handle forward with fluidity, took a step with his left leg, and snapped his wrist all at the same time. Then he let the length of the whip follow through until the popper did its work. "My goodness, that was a loud crack," Caroline said, holding her ears. Then she clapped enthusiastically. "You are really good at this, Mr. Hurricane." "Well, I'm not as good as some of the other teamsters. They can flick a fly off the rump of an ox while they're driving." "That is amazing," she said, laughing in wonder. "Is it my turn to try?" Hurricane wasn't sure she was quite ready yet. Then he got an idea of how to help her get the feel of the whip before she tried the whole process. "Now, just to get used to the feel and weight of the whip, I want you to swing it in a circle above your head." Caroline waited for Hurricane to move out of the way. She lifted the whip up and cautiously started to twirl it over her head. "Ooh," she squealed. "This is very wily to control, but it's kind of fun to feel the power of this little piece of leather in my hand. See how you have to twist your wrist as you go around? Hang on tightly and see if you can go a little faster." Caroline obliged, but after a few more rounds, she began to panic. "All right, now how do I stop this thing?" "Stay calm, Sister Cleverly," he coaxed, realizing that he was starting to panic too. He wasn't exactly sure how to get her out of this predicament. Try to slow it down," he heard himself saying. But Caroline was caught up in the force of the whip rotating and couldn't see a way to stop what she was doing without having the whip wrap itself around her face several times. She started to whimper, "Help me! Help me!" Hurricane wondered if he could just run inside the center of the circling whip and take it over for her. He felt this was about his only choice, but before he could act on it, Caroline unexpectedly let go of the handle, and being off balance, she was thrown to the ground on her rear end. She instinctively covered her head with her arms as the twirling whip took its horizontal journey in front of her toward the willows and Hurricane. He automatically ducked the rotating blade that flew past him. Then he rushed to Caroline's side. "Are you all right, Sister Cleverly?" Caroline felt many emotions at once: embarrassment, fear, relief, and finally peals of laughter took over. "Oh my, that was the funniest thing that has ever happened to me. What a sight that must have been. I'm so sorry I couldn't hold on to the handle." Hurricane couldn't see the humor in the situation when it was happening, but now that it was over, he could, and together they laughed and consoled each other over the foolhardiness of the teaching moment. "I'm sorry I got you into this mess," apologized Hurricane. "I thought it was a good notion at the time. It was interesting to say the least, but I don't want to give up. I want to try again. You know what they say about falling off a horse." "All right, but no more overhead exercises." Hurricane helped Caroline get the whip in position and moved to the sidelines. Caroline took a deep breath and mimicked what she saw Hurricane do earlier. She lifted the whip up, took a step forward with her left foot, threw the whip forward, and snapped her wrist at the perfect moment. The sweet sound of a sharp crack met her ears as the whip returned obediently to its home on the ground with nary a welt on her body. "That was incredible, Sister Cleverly," he said, clapping. Caroline was ecstatic. "It was, wasn't it?" That's the end of chapter 24. Over and out. Boom.